Rebecca always believed that happiness had finally knocked on her door when she met Daniel. He was everything she had ever dreamed of: caring, charming, the kind of man who knew exactly what to say to make any woman feel special. And for a time, he managed to enchant Rebecca, wrapping her in promises of a perfect future. The relationship started intensely. Daniel seemed to read her mind, anticipating every desire, every need. He made her laugh, feel alive again after years of loneliness and romantic frustrations. But like a thin mist that fades at dawn, this perfect image began to dissolve. The first cracks appeared subtly. A derogatory comment here, a burst of anger there. He always apologized afterward, promising to change, and Rebecca, caught in the illusion, always believed him. But more and more, the sweet words turned into screams, and the affection he showed in the early months soon gave way to cold and calculated violence. Daniel was manipulative, playing with her insecurities, and Rebecca felt like she was slowly being dragged into an emotional abyss with no way out. However, something inside her began to stir. The fear that had initially dominated her turned into a growing rage, an urgent need to take back control of her life. And in the darkness of her lonely nights, as she heard Daniel's heavy footsteps upstairs, a plan began to form. Rebecca knew she couldn't simply run away. Daniel would find her. He always promised he would. No, she needed to be smarter. She had to make sure he would never hurt her again in any way. She began to prepare everything in silence. She discreetly researched, studying stories of revenge that had gone unnoticed. And little by little, she started gathering the necessary elements for her final plan. Daniel suspected nothing. He continued his routine of emotional and physical abuse, believing that Rebecca was too broken to fight back. But he didn't know that every tear she shed was, in fact, the fuel for something much darker. The day of revenge came quietly, on a cold winter night. Rebecca chose the perfect moment. Daniel arrived late from work as always, and didn't notice the small changes in the house. Dinner was on the table as usual, but that night, there was something different in the air. The poison she had placed in his drink wasn't enough to kill him. She knew he was too strong for something that simple. But it would be enough to paralyze him, to leave him defenseless. And by the time Daniel realized something was wrong, it was already too late. His eyes widened in terror as his body no longer responded to his commands. He tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat. Rebecca watched him, feeling the power return to her hands for the first time. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding, but her mind cold and calculated. "You always said I wouldn't be able to live without you," she whispered, leaning over him. "But tonight, Daniel, it's you who won't be leaving here." What followed that night was a slow and meticulous process of destruction. Rebecca had studied ways to inflict pain without leaving visible marks. She wanted him to feel every second, for the fear and despair to be the last emotions he would ever experience. Daniel's disappearance was a mystery that was never solved. Rebecca, with her angelic face and irreproachable behavior, was never suspected. She returned to her quiet life, but something was different about her. A coldness and emptiness in her gaze, as if the revenge had consumed what remained of her soul. She never told anyone what she did. She didn't need to. The nights when she awoke hearing whispers in the dark, the visions of Daniel in the corners of the house, were constant reminders that, although she had won the battle against him, the true horror had only just begun. Rebecca kept looking at Daniel, paralyzed on the dining room floor. His gaze fixed on her but unable to move a muscle. She crouched beside him, her fingers lightly sliding across his face in an almost affectionate gesture, but her eyes were cold. The man who once had complete control over her was now at her mercy. You always thought you were invincible, didn't you? Rebecca's voice was low, almost a whisper, but laden with tension she could barely contain. You always thought I would never have the courage to stand up to you. She stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen, where she had left the tools she had been collecting. The metallic sound of the knife echoed through the house as she picked it up from the counter. But Rebecca wasn't interested in a quick end. That would be too easy for him, and Daniel didn't deserve that. Not after everything he had put her through. The panic in Daniel's eyes grew with each passing second, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to breathe deeply, but his body simply wouldn't respond. He was trapped, with no escape, and the terror that overwhelmed his mind was exactly what Rebecca wanted. She returned, now with the knife in hand, but crouched again, unhurried. She knew she had time, that no one would come that night. The house was isolated enough that no one would hear the screams, if Daniel could make any sound at all. I spent so much time being afraid of you, Daniel, she said, twirling the knife slowly between her fingers. But fear is something that can transform into something else. She lifted her gaze, staring directly at him. Anger. And now it's your turn to feel what it's like to live in fear. Rebecca started slowly. Her first strike was precise, hitting the side of Daniel's arm. The blood dripped, but he couldn't move, barely able to react beyond the frantic increase of his heartbeat that echoed in his ears. He was completely at her mercy, and Rebecca relished every second of it. Each cut she made was calculated, measured, done with the precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She wasn't interested in killing him quickly. She wanted him to feel. Pain was now her ally, a reminder of everything she had suffered. The words he used to break her resurfaced in her mind. Every insult, every threat, every subtle manipulation. And with each memory, a new strike. Although Daniel couldn't move, he felt everything. His mind screamed, but his body was mute, and that terrified him even more. The silence around him, broken only by her whispers and the sounds of the cuts, was like a closed tomb, muffling any hope of escape. When Rebecca finally stopped, hours had passed. She was covered in sweat, but her gaze was steadier than ever. Daniel no longer looked like the arrogant man who once controlled her. He was a shadow of himself, his body a tangled mess of cuts and bruises. But Rebecca wasn't done yet. She slowly stood, breathing deeply, and stepped away from him, leaving the bloodied knife on the floor. The poison was beginning to wear off, and Daniel, now exhausted and weak, felt his body respond in slow, painful increments. He tried to move his lips, but no sound came out. Each attempt to speak was swallowed by desperation. Rebecca walked over to the fireplace, where a bottle of kerosene was discreetly hidden. She grabbed it and returned, pouring the liquid calmly over Daniel's half-conscious body. The acrid smell filled the air, mixed with the metallic odor of blood. You always said I was weak, that I would never survive without you, she said, her voice now laced with a tone of resolve, almost emotionless. But you were wrong, Daniel. I'm stronger than you ever imagined. She pulled a match from her pocket, striking it with a quick motion. The crackle of the flame burning the small piece of wood was the only sound that echoed through the room. Daniel, with his senses slowly returning, realized what was about to happen. He tried to move, tried to scream, but it was too late. Rebecca looked one last time at the man who had destroyed her life. Without saying another word, she dropped the match, watching as the fire quickly spread across his kerosene-soaked body. The flames began to lick the floor, rising and consuming everything in their path. Rebecca stood in silence, her cold eyes fixed on the scene in front of her. The heat from the flames intensified, but she didn't move. The crackling of the fire mixed with Daniel's muffled groans, until the sound was gradually replaced by the roar of the devouring blaze. When she finally turned her back on the scene, Rebecca walked slowly out of the house. The night air was cold and crisp, in stark contrast to the growing heat she left behind. The orange glow of the flames reflected on her back, but Rebecca didn't look back. She walked down the deserted road, feeling a strange sense of freedom. The house was engulfed by the fire. By the time the firefighters arrived, it was too late to save anything. Daniel's body was found among the ashes, but with the cuts and destruction caused by the fire, little remained to be analyzed. The case was filed away as an accident, a tragedy caused by a reckless man who perhaps had lit his own destruction. Rebecca moved on with her life. She never spoke of that night to anyone. Deep in her mind, she knew that the shadows of that house and Daniel's muffled screams would follow her forever. But that was a small price to pay for the freedom she had finally won. But sometimes, in the depths of the night, when silence dominated the darkness around her, Rebecca swore she could hear a whisper, a distant echo, a familiar voice. And in those moments, her heart would race, not from fear, but from a strange sense of justice, because she knew that, somehow, Daniel was still there, waiting in the shadows. But now he was the victim, and she, at last, the executioner.